Thanks so much for that kind introduction, and to the organizers of this important conference for inviting me to participate. I want to speak to you about Freedom Now, the NGO that I founded a decade ago to free prisoners of conscience around the world. The very reason that we exist is because of the brave people, like many of you in the audience here today, who daily put your lives at risk fighting for freedom, democracy, and human rights. The core of our mission is to support you when your activities put you in harm's way. In the brief time that I have, I thought it might be most interesting for me to describe how I got involved in this work, and then how Freedom Now is different from other NGOs, touching on what we found to be the most effective advocacy strategies on behalf of individual prisoners of conscience. I'm often asked what led me to found an NGO that works to free these kinds of prisoners. After all, it's pretty frustrating and nearly impossible work. In March of 2000, I was a law student at the University of Michigan Law School. I was interning with a human rights organization in London, and I picked up the Evening Standard before getting on the tube ride home and read in the newspaper about James Mawdsley, a 27-year-old British national who was imprisoned in Burma. Several years before, James witnessed the brutality firsthand of the Burmese regime when it torched the village that he was teaching in. He began a one-man campaign against the junta. In the fall of 1999, he returned to Burma and began distributing pro-democracy leaflets. By the end of the day, he had been arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to 17 years in solitary confinement. After his parents agreed to work with us, I filed James's case before the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. The working group is an independent and impartial body at the UN that now works as part of the UN Human Rights Council. I got members of Congress involved. This included a bipartisan letter written to the Burmese junta urging James's release, and I worked with the British Foreign Office. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. We had a few things come together to trigger James's release. By the time I returned from my last year in law school, not only did we win our judgment at the United Nations, which found that James's detention was in clear violation of international law, but just as we were making the decision public, the British government reported that he had been beaten into a pulp in his prison cell. With word of these two developments coming out in the same week, outrage mounted swiftly, and within days, the Burmese junta caved. I received a call in my law school dorm that James was being released. I quickly hopped on a plane to London, and a few short days later, James arrived after 416 days in solitary confinement. I watched from 10 feet away his private reunion with his parents, sister, and twin brother, embracing him in a private lounge just off of the runway. James then came over to me, gave me a firm handshake, and said, "You saved my life." We all cried. It was an extraordinary moment, and needless to say, I was hooked. A decade later, James remains an activist and is currently studying to become a Catholic priest. In reflecting on this experience, I'm not entirely sure what gave me the audacity to take on the Burmese junta, but I soon realized that even as a law student, and merely as one person who wanted to make a difference, I could impact people's lives, and I felt incredibly empowered. That said, however, I wasn't overly impressed with myself. I'd gotten a white guy out of a Burmese prison. The real question was whether the formula that I had stumbled across could be applied successfully to a Pakistani in a Pakistani prison, or a Chinese person in a Chinese prison, and so on. And so in 2001, I gathered a group of friends together to found Freedom Now. Our mission is to free prisoners of conscience through legal, political, and public relations advocacy efforts. Since that day, we've gotten numerous people out of prison around the world. These include Ayub Masih, a Pakistani Christian who was on death row for blasphemy in Pakistan. He was accused of telling his neighbor to, quote, "check out that book by Salman Rushdie." Pham Hong Song, a Vietnamese doctor who received a 13-year prison sentence after merely translating a page from the US Embassy website entitled "What is Democracy?" and giving it to several friends. And Yang Jianli, a Chinese scholar and activist sentenced to 5 years in prison as a spy for Taiwan. It is our firm belief that by defending the defenders, like many of you, the impact of our work is multiplied, not only by enabling you to return to your important work, but also by the legal precedents that we set and the broader awareness that we raise about the human rights situations in the countries in which we work. Now let me tell you how Freedom Now is perhaps a little different from other organizations. First, we only represent prisoners as our clients, which means we are retained by a member of their family. This gives us the ability to rally governments and organizations and speak authoritatively on the prisoners' behalf. As an illustration, since 2006, we have represented the world's only imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi. Previously, as no one represented her as international counsel, no one had represented her, and advocacy on her behalf was all force and no vector. But once we represented her, we were able to persuade 30 NGOs to work on a common goal, and together we recruited a group of 112 former presidents and prime ministers from more than 50 countries around the world, including Mart Lahr, I would add, to urge UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to travel to Burma and press the junta to release Aung San Suu Kyi and the 2,100 other political prisoners in the country. On the day the letter was sent, former Norwegian Prime Minister Kjell Magne Bondevik, with whom Freedom Now also collaborated on the letter, spoke to the Secretary General, who subsequently called a group of Friends of Myanmar meeting 2 days later, and a short time after that went to Burma, taking another small but important step to press for her freedom. Second, we sequenced legal, political, and public relations advocacy on behalf of our clients to have the greatest impact. For example, in our representation of Father Thaddeus Win Van Lee in Vietnam, a democracy and religious freedom advocate, we did everything from winning his case before the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, to holding press conferences, to securing a resolution from the United States Congress demanding his release, to publishing op-eds in newspapers. Many groups do pieces of what we do, but by timing the actions to occur in a way to maximize the impact, we have found that there is a much greater effect. We secured Father Lee's release under a previous term of detention in January of 2005, and then after yet another arrest, we secured his release again this past month. Finally, we take on the cases of prisoners of conscience whose detention are illustrative of a broader set of abuses in a country. We hope that by helping one individual, we will help a broader class of people. For example, a few months ago, we began representing Gao Zhisheng, the leading human rights lawyer in China who disappeared in February of 2009. His is one of the most egregious examples of China's recent crackdown on political dissidents, and in particular, human rights lawyers. Our pressure on the Chinese government, which included filing cases in the United Nations, in the Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances, as well as with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, working with the US, UK, and EU governments to apply private and public pressure, and publishing several op-eds in major newspapers, substantially increased the negative attention focused on his disappearance and resulted in an equally mysterious reappearance a few weeks ago. We are now pressing to be able to help him leave China at the right point in time and be reunited with his family in the United States. And while our primary focus has been to secure his release, our pressure is also intended to increase the cost for China for targeting and detaining human rights lawyers. So let me come full circle back to Burma. The work Freedom Now does is all about the personal and human stories of those who fight for freedom and democracy in their own countries. On March 19th, 2010, I again experienced a wonderful airport moment that makes all of this work worthwhile. Nini Aung, a Burmese-born American, embraced his fiancée at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. after almost 7 months of imprisonment by the Burmese junta. His imprisonment included being denied food and water for 10 days, being repeatedly beaten, and being kept awake around the clock during his interrogation, and a separate 5-week stint in a military dog cell in the dark with no bedding or a toilet. Nini's story is no different from many of you in the audience here today. Despite having the possibility of leading a comfortable life, he refused to give up advocating for democracy in Burma. His grassroots organizing on behalf of political prisoners incurred the wrath of the junta, and on September 3rd, 2009, He was arrested upon trying to enter the country. He merely wanted to see his mother, who herself was a political prisoner and who had been denied medical treatment for her cancer. After a sham trial on false charges, he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with hard labor. And after intensive work, both publicly and privately, by Freedom Now, Nini is now back in the United States and able to return to his activities, fighting for freedom and democracy in Burma. I think it's fair to say that his smile says it all. Each of these little victories, no matter how despotic the regime, matters, not only because it means the world to the dissidents that we represent and their families, but also because it sends a clear message to the detaining government that the international community will not tolerate its acting with impunity. Having been personally involved in this kind of work for more than a decade, what I find most remarkable is that freedom is in fact a universal value across all cultures. Indeed, regardless of the dramatically different domestic situations, every human being yearns to be free and speaks of freedom and the need to persevere against oppression in similar language. And so, as you look to some of the ongoing cases that we are involved in, let me close with Robert Kennedy's observation made in a speech at the University of Cape Town in South Africa 2 years to the day before he himself was assassinated. The speech was given in the darkest days of apartheid. He said, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Your presence here today only reaffirms that one person can truly make a difference. Thank you very much.